Tales of superstition are full of black cats. It's one of the things of stereotypes, mostly seen as an evil omen or a witch's familiar. But when you really start looking at ghost stories related with animals, you can't help but notice that the dog seems to be around a lot more than a cat, most notably the black dog. Stories of a ghostly black dog are all over the globe, and the origins of these beasts are just as widespread. And here in the South, well, that's no exception. There's always the beast of this place, the black dog of that place. The black dog pops up in our oldest mythologies, all the way to modern-day trucker tales. It'd be very difficult to do a presentation and try to encompass all of the different varieties. But there's one in particular that we'll focus on today. It's not unique to the South, though. As with many of our other traditions, it's something that was brought over the Atlantic from Europe, an ancient tradition. But as with many of those, it's a tradition that is still practiced in remote parts of the South even today. And with many of those traditions, a good amount of ghostly tales comes along with them. In English folklore, they are called the Church Grim. Here in the South and remote areas of Appalachia, it's been shortened a bit. Around here, we simply call it Grim. Everyone loves a good, strange, weird, or bizarre story. Well, welcome to the American South, where dark legends and haunted history lurk around every corner. Where superstition, folklore, and a touch of backwoods magic blend with everyday culture. Some say, in order to survive. This is Dixie After Dark. This one is a relatively new one for me. Not the stories itself, but the origins of it. Ghostly tales of large black dogs are pretty common around these parts. For the longest time, they all seemed to be much of the same, and my assumption was that these would be tied back to the belief in some sort of simplified werewolf tale, a possible dogman, or the remnant stories of some sort of hellhound. With many of these, I began to lean more toward the stories of a dark omen or a hellhound, but some of the stories didn't seem to be connected to some creature of hell, searching for lost souls to drag back to hell with it. Just some of the stories. Of course, there were dark, ghostly aspects of some of the tales for sure, but some of these just seemed to be trying to run people off, not actually attacking or taking your soul. Not to say I would try pushing my luck and see if they wouldn't attack at all. I'm not quite that crazy. There were tales of black dogs roaming the forest, some in abandoned structures, and areas that had some dark past connected to them. But the one-off stories all seem to revolve around something similar: cemeteries. These were the stories that had the black dog stalking you, watching you, then chasing you away from these cemeteries, especially if your intentions were not up to par. But it wasn't until I was chatting with Jared over at the channel Jared King TV that I found out these particular stories could be connected, and that the specific black dogs had a name. Jared specializes in tales out of Appalachia, and in those parts, the black dog is known as a Grim. Now, Old Grim has a rich history and folk beliefs, one that stretches back through the centuries to the old countries in Europe. Some believe that the practices still happen in some remote areas of Wales, and according to many people that I've talked to since learning about these stories, in Appalachia and rural communities here in the South as well, at least up until around 100 years or so ago. And as with many of these practices, it wouldn't surprise me if they still take place today. In these areas, old beliefs die hard, if ever. According to folklore, when a new church or cemetery was founded, the first soul buried there would be tasked to be the guardian of the cemetery. Some actually seen it as a curse. The guardian of the cemetery would be tasked to protect the others buried there against vandals, grave robbers, occultists, and some say, even the devil himself. It was an ancient Christian belief and practice, and it just didn't sit right with the people in those communities that a person's soul would be forced to be a restless guardian of the dead, and not move on to heaven or hell as it should. So to counteract this, a large black dog would be buried alive first, usually in the grounds that would later become the cemetery, or under the cornerstone of the church that was to be built. In the old countries, this beastly guardian became known as a church grim. From all accounts, it appears that these spirits originated from English and Nordic folklore. There are some accounts of the guardian being other animals, but the black dog seems to be the most common. If that is due to other animals being buried alive, or the church grim being able to take on multiple forms, seems to change a little from story to story. The church grim seems to be isolated to these properties, never leaving or not being allowed to leave the grounds it's tasked to protect. In English tradition, the church grim is said to be a large black dog with red eyes. It's believed that the church grim will ring the church bells at midnight, the night before someone in the community will pass away. There is even reports of clergy members seeing the church grims peeking out of the church windows or from some other hiding spot during funerals. The church grim is known to show itself both day and night, always on the job, it seems. Another related story comes from Yorkshire. There's a bridge known as the Devil's Bridge, which spans the River Yore. There had been several attempts to build a bridge strong enough to withstand the frequent floods of the river, but each time the bridge fell. It wasn't until the devil himself appeared to the community, promising to build them a bridge that would hold up. Of course, there would have to be some sort of payment. The first living being to cross the bridge would be a living sacrifice to the devil, condemned to forever haunt the bridge and anything that passed by it in the future. And just like that, a bridge appeared overnight. The villagers were wary of the bridge though. Perhaps not as much as I would have been, but anyways. They thought long and hard about how to decide who would be the unfortunate soul to be sent across the bridge first. It was then that a local shepherd had an idea. He volunteered to cross the river, but not by the bridge. Rather, he chose to swim across the river and climbed out on the other side of the bridge. Once safely on shore, he whistled for his dog to follow, a large black dog, conveniently named Grim. Grimm quickly answered his master's call, running across the newly constructed bridge, thus becoming the sacrifice needed to complete their deal with the devil. The villagers then named the bridge Kilgrim Bridge, which over time mashed the words together to be known as Kilgrim Bridge, which oddly enough still stands today. In Scandinavian folklore, the stories of the Church Grimm are much the same. In their legends, the Grimm lives in the church towers during the daytime. In Scandinavian practices, though, a lamb would be buried beneath the cornerstone of the church, and the dog in the cemetery. The dog would become the Church Grimm, while the lamb wasn't as much of a sinister spirit. The lamb would be known to be seen to those that entered the church when services were not going on. But if the lamb was ever seen in the graveyard itself, it was an omen that predicted the death of a child. Back here in the American South, the practice and legends are much the same, the only glaring difference being that the name of the spirit has been shortened from Church Grimm to simply Grimm. Tradition says that a Grimm is to be buried in the north section of a new cemetery. Now, the big catch here in the South was the fact that not all rural communities had their own churchyards. Many Southerners in the day were known to travel to attend church services. This, of course, left many areas without a designated cemetery of their own. Back then, it was very common for families to bury their dead on their own property, in small, secluded family cemeteries. In these cases, the tradition of the Church Grimm was still practiced though. But with the thought of these smaller family cemeteries not being actual consecrated ground, extra precautions were taken. Many tales have a Grimm being buried with each family member that died, usually at the head or foot of the human corpse, a sort of eternal guardian or companion for each person. If the tradition and belief still holds true, that would put multiple Grimms tied to these locations. Many of these small, isolated cemeteries have become lost over time, as the properties were sometimes abandoned, nature slowly reclaiming and hiding any evidence of previous human presence. Could this be the reason behind some of the accounts of random ghostly hounds stalking what appears to be lonely remote sections of the forest or lonely forgotten roadways? If you've ever spent any extended time in the South, then you know how common these lost cemeteries really are. Heck, one was even found on my family's land after it was purchased, one that no one even knew about until some of the overgrowth was cleared out. The possibility of this being an explanation of these seemingly random ghost dogs actually being old Grimms feels pretty solid, at least to me. To prove it though, you would have to search the areas for these lost cemeteries, thus putting you in the direct line of an old Grimm itself, so do so at your own risk. If this is not the case, then we don't know what or why these creatures are there. I guess we'd have to approach each case individually and see what histories the locations hold for us. And that's what we'll do here. If the stories can be found, that is.